that getting warmer now?
Yeah, we are lucky this summer. It's actually in the Netherlands. It's actually a relatively mild summer, not at all hot. In the southern European countries, as you may have seen, it's really hot this year. But in the Netherlands, not at all actually. So I am indeed concerned, but at the moment it's all quite fine here in the Netherlands.
I see. It's nice. And also in Indonesia, no, it's also summer probably, but the summer in here is different from the summer in Netherlands because in Indonesia we only have two, yeah, the dry and wet season. So dry season considered to be summer, no rainfall during this season. And maybe probably it's lucky because in your country there are 4 seasons, yeah. Spring and then summer, winter, autumn and winter. Yeah. So more variable in joining life.
I must say, I always find the winter a little bit depressing here in
I see.
the Netherlands. But I won't complain about that.
Okay. Have you ever been to Indonesia, bro?
No, I haven't. I do have some Indonesian roots with my mother's family actually having an Indonesian background, but I haven't been there myself. No.
Okay.
So I hope at some point in the future that it will indeed be possible for me to visit your country. It would be great.
Okay, maybe the participant want to ask the rest of the time maybe before starting. Sorry, in your area, are there lots of Indonesian people there, or just few people living?
I must admit that I don't know so many Indonesian colleagues. So from that point of view, I was actually really pleasantly surprised to get your invitation and to have the opportunity to meet with all of you, with your community. So I don't think at the moment I know in my kind of area of work, I know a lot of Indonesian colleagues.
Okay.
So I will just turn off my camera, if that's okay, for 2 or 3 minutes, just to do some little bit of final preparation, and then I will be back.
Okay, by all means, bro.
Yep.
Saya mau nyapa teman-teman yang lain yang baru bergabung ini. Ada Mas Cahyo, ada Bu Ika, Sis Roro, Pak Sugeng, Waten Nuwun. Nah, ini ada teman jauh ini Pak Faiz. Pak Faiz sehat? Pak Faiz. Sorry, I'm trying to say hello to our friends using Indonesian, Prof. Ludo.
Ya, sehat, Pak Heri.
Halo Pak Faiz.
Selamat. Ya, alhamdulillah sehat, baik. Selamat berkonferensi.
Terima kasih. Ditunggu sebenarnya di Semarang itu kemarin Pak Faiz. Banyak yang nyari.
Salam untuk kawan-kawan semua.
Hello, Pak Heri.
Yeah, Pak Jung.
Yeah, you may start talking, yeah, before, yeah, rather than just keeping silent in the Zoom.
Yeah, I just confirmed to the Mas Cahyo as committed to admit the participant in the waiting room. So once they have joining, then Nabila can start the event.
Prof. Ludo, so in Netherlands now is nearly 4 EM, yeah, in the morning, yeah.
Well, fortunately, it's 5
It's, oh,
PM,
5,
rather
already
than
5,
4.
yeah, so not 6 time distance, but 5, yeah.
5,
in
yes.
Indonesia
Yeah.
is okay, yeah. And usually for Western people, it's still time to sleep well, usually, but you should be ready in the Zoom. Thank you, bro. Yeah, I think time's already 10 a.m. So the committee may start maybe.
MC, silahkan Mbak Nabila.
Yeah. First of all, does my voice is actually clear enough?
Yes, clear.
Yes, okay.
Yes, okay.
Okay. Yeah. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Honorable Dean Faculty of Humanities, Dr. Nur Hayati M. Hum, represented by Director of Study of Library Science, Diponegoro University, Dr. Herianto Esos MEM, and also Honorable Prof. Dr. Ludo Erwatman, Fast Fever developer from Leiden University, as our great speaker today, and also Honorable Dr. Andes Jumino M. Hum as our event moderator. I am Nabila, as your Master of Ceremony, welcome you to the event of Bibliometric Conference Visiting Professor session. So from Faculty of Humanities Diponegoro University, we are so glad to manage this session with our honorable guest speaker, Prof. Ludo. And without further ado, we welcome Mr. Haryanto to give the speech representing our faculty. Time and place are yours, Pak.
Thank you, Nabila. I would like to say hello and welcome to everyone here. I would like to welcome to, and especially to Professor Ludo Erwatman from Leiden University. Welcome to Semarang, Indonesia. Even now it's by Zoom, but hopefully in the future we can invite you to come physically to Semarang, Indonesia, especially in Diponegoro University. So this is a 2 days event. It's a bibliometric conference, Indonesian Bibliometric Conference. I think we are so proud that it's the first conference that we conduct. This is a cooperation between the library science study program and also by the ECP, we call it Ikatan Sarjana Ilmu Perpustakaan. So it's an association for the library and information science associations, and also by the library center in Undip or Diponegoro University. And today, especially today, we also have will be like a speech from Professor Ludo that will speak about bibliometrics in the era of science. And I believe this is a very important speech for all of us for today, especially mostly in here are librarians and also library science students, but also we have students from the postgraduate. We also have a postgraduate student from many universities and also from multidisciplines. So we are very proud to have this conference. And that said, I would like to welcome to everyone here, and I hope all of us have a very enjoying time today with Prof. Ludo and from the whole everyone here. So I also would like to thank you for the committee, from the ECP and from the students, from all the lecturers as well who have worked to make this conference happen. Thank you very much. I would like to return back to the Nabila. Thank you, Nabila.
Yeah, thank you for Mr. Haryanto. And we will entering the presentation and lead by Mr. Jumino. But first of all, let me introduce him. Maybe the operator can help me for the screen. Yeah, now here he is our great and also honorable moderator. He is Dr. Andes Jumino M. Hum. He is one of lecturer in our University of Diponegoro, and here he's our academic qualification, which is Master of Librarianship from University of Wales and also Master of Literature Diponegoro University. And as lecturer, he also have teaching focus, which as you can see in the screen, first is library interior design and development, English for librarians and archivists, and so many more. And maybe scroll. Operator, can you scroll down the screen, please? Yeah, and here, as you can see, also he has a recent research publications, which is I cannot read one by one, because I think you guys also very excited to meeting our moderator and also a great speaker. And yeah, I think that's all. I think you guys already see how amazing our moderator today. And yeah, I think without further ado, I will give the time and screen to the Mr. Jumino. Time and place are yours, Pak.
Okay, thank you, Mbak Nabila, for the time and opportunity for me to moderate this webinars. Yeah, and first of all, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and good morning, all of the participants, especially Prof. Ludo, to present in this seminar today. Yeah, and it must be very interesting seminar today because the topics relates to what have already done by the participant, yeah, starting from yesterday's, yeah, during the workshop on bibliographic, yeah, sorry, on bibliometric, yeah, bibliographic or bibliographic in the era of open access. So it means that very close related to librarians, yeah, especially in managing library, yeah, dealing with bibliography, and also in predicting or in anticipating for the future growth, yeah, dealing with the metric in the numbers, yeah, in like graphics or something like this, yeah. Okay, and for a student will be very beneficial, yeah, especially in encouraging or improving the knowledge, yeah, because this time the era of open access is getting more popular for students, yeah. Okay, but before starting from the seminar, so please the operator to show the curriculum vitae from Prof. Ludo, yeah, to be presented on screen. And maybe I do apologize, Prof. Ludo, because I just take from internet. Maybe it's something not fit, so I just take from the internet. Okay, please, Mbak Nabila, to displaying the CV. Yeah, I've already sent. Okay, then if not, and then I try to read the curriculum vitae. Let's see. Yeah, Prof. Ludo, right? Prof. Dr. Watchmans. That's it. So many publication here. Yeah, that's already published. Yeah, already. Yeah, publication. Yeah, the journal publication about 78. That it's impossible for me to mention one by one. Yeah, so many. Yes, very extraordinary for Prof. Ludo. Yeah, and now Prof. Ludo is as one of the lecturers, yeah, in the Leiden University, and having our very experts in bibliometrics. Yeah. Okay, and now time is for Prof. Ludo to present, yeah, this in this seminar. After that, there will be some question about this. Okay, please, Prof. Ludo, the time is yours.
Thank you, Professor Yumino. Good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be at your event. Thank you so much to the organizers for the kind invitation. I'm actually quite excited. This is the first time, I believe, the first time I'm addressing an audience in your country, in Indonesia. So I will start by sharing my screen because I have some slides. I hope you can now all see my slides. I would like, this morning, I would like to share with you some of my ideas on bibliometrics in relation to a development in the research system that I feel is really essential at the moment, and that is the movement towards open science, the movement towards more open ways of working in research. And I believe, and I will try to make the argument, that bibliometrics and open science are connected to each other in some very important ways. And I will offer some reflections on that, and I also hope we will have some opportunity to discuss these connections. Let me first say a little bit about the center that I'm affiliated with. So I'm based in the Netherlands at Leiden University. And at my university, we have a center that is called the Center for Science and Technology Studies. So at the left here, you see our building in Leiden in the Netherlands. So our center, it's abbreviated CWTS. So the full name is Center for Science and Technology Studies. We study the research system, we study research practices, and we also try to contribute to improving the way in which research is done and the way the research system is organized. So we have a team of people, you can also see them on this slide, and we're all dedicating themselves to studying how the research system is done and how we can improve it. And the work that I'm sharing today is work that is also partly inspired by all the collaborations with this great team of colleagues in Leiden. And I will focus in particular on this UNESCO, on the developments around open science. And what you see here on this slide is the UNESCO recommendation on open science that perhaps some of you may be familiar with. So this was a document that was published relatively recently by UNESCO, and that offers a very broad perspective on what is referred to as open science. It's a broad development in the research system that is trying to make the way we practice science more open and more transparent in all kinds of ways. So one element is the development towards open access publishing that was already briefly mentioned. So making sure that research articles are free to access. That's one element of this broad agenda of open science, but it is actually much, much more than just open access publishing. It's also, for instance, about research data being open to access. It is about research software being open source. But it's also about engagement with societal actors in the research process, for making participation in the scientific process more open. These are all different elements of this broad agenda or this broad movement towards open science. And I will today offer some reflections on this open science movement that I believe is crucial, a crucial development that we are going through at the moment, and how this whole development relates to work that is done in the area of bibliometrics. And bibliometrics is an area in which we at my center, we have a history now of almost 40 years. So actually, my center at Leiden University was one of the first research centers globally that was fully specialized in doing bibliometric work, bibliometric research. So we have now 4 decades of a history of 4 decades in this field. And I will offer reflections on this movement towards open science based on this 40-year history in bibliometrics. So what I will do is I will focus actually on two topics related to bibliometrics and open science. So one is the developments towards open scholarly publishing. So the way we publish is evolving, is becoming more and more open, partly thanks to the open access movement, but actually there's much more going on. And I will offer some reflections on this, and I will also discuss what this means for the way in which we do bibliometrics. The second topic that I would like to cover this morning is a topic that I refer to as open publication metadata. So bibliometrics is about studying research outputs, and in particular scientific publications. And we typically study these publications based on their metadata, based on the data that we have available about these publications. And I will make the argument that this data that we have about scientific publications and the data that is kind of the foundation based on which bibliometrics is practiced, that data itself also should be more open, in line with the broader development towards open science. So I will share with you some of my own views on these developments. I will also show you some of my own research in this area. And I will tell you more about the direction in which we are going in my center, in Leiden University, the direction in which we are moving at the moment, right now, in the light of all these developments related to open science. Okay, let me start by discussing open scholarly publishing. So I will show to you the development that I think we are going through at the moment, which I believe is an exciting development in the way in which publishing is organized. So what researchers do, and I guess many of you also have this experience yourself, researchers write articles. They do research, and then at some point they feel their research is ready to be shared with the outside world, and they prepare an article in which they document their work and through which they want to communicate their work to colleagues and to peers. Traditionally, this is typically done by publishing these articles in journals. And I think you all know the process. Researchers submit articles to a journal. Journals then organize peer review to evaluate the quality of these articles. And depending on the outcome of that process, that peer review process, journals may decide to publish an article in the journal, or journals may decide not to publish an article. So if the peer review process indicates that the quality is insufficient, then a journal may say, no, this article is actually not good enough to publish in our journal. There are too many problems regarding the quality of this work. This is how traditionally publishing is done. And as you know, publishing an article in a journal is also something that, from the point of view of the authors, the researchers that have prepared the article, is kind of a way to get recognition for their work. It's a recognition that the work they are doing is scientifically sound, is valuable, and deserves to be rewarded. What we also have nowadays is this idea that articles that are published in journals should be openly accessible. So in the past, articles typically ended up behind paywalls. You needed to have a subscription to a journal, and only then you could read the articles. Over the past 2 decades, we have seen this development where there is a widespread recognition that actually articles being closed behind paywalls is problematic, because it means that many people, researchers, but also other stakeholders or societal stakeholders cannot benefit from the research. So it's important that we make sure our articles are openly accessible. And as you know, we have more and more journals that support open access, that enable articles to be made openly accessible, which in itself is a good development. But there are also downsides. And one important downside is that often the way journals organize open access is expensive. So more and more what we see is that journals charge a fee to authors, so-called APC, the article processing charge, and authors are expected to pay that fee in order to make their article openly accessible in a journal. And these fees can be really large. They can be thousands of euros, for instance, thousands of dollars, a lot of money for researchers in many parts of the world. So we have, of course, differences between countries in kind of income levels. So I'm myself privileged to live in a country where we have a well-funded research system. So we have access to relatively significant amounts of funding. But even in a country like mine, a well-resourced country like the Netherlands, we struggle to pay these so-called APCs, and it's sometimes a major obstacle to publishing research open access. In other parts of the world, of course, this problem is even bigger. So yeah, the system, in the way we have it at the moment, is creating challenges. Yes, it enables us to publish research in journals. These journals do quality control for us. That's all important. Researchers get rewarded for publishing in these journals. That's all fine. But to make the research openly accessible, we often pay a lot of money. And many people argue, and I would agree with that in many cases, actually, these payments are excessive. And this also leads to all kinds of effects of excluding certain researchers, scholars from participating in the research process, which I think is highly undesirable. So yes, the system as we have it at the moment is in some sense actually not really working the way it should. And it is, this raises the question, of course, like, can we do better? Can we reform the system in a way to make it better serve the research community and make it better serve society at large? There's one other issue that I didn't mention yet, but articles that get rejected by journals, typically they are then submitted by researchers to a different journal, because researchers ultimately want to publish their work, and if one journal doesn't consider the work to be sufficiently not good enough, then researchers will just submit it somewhere else to a different journal. And that means also that we have this kind of iterative process where articles may get submitted to a number of journals sequentially. And all these journals evaluate the work, and typically at some point there will be a journal that is going to publish the work. And there are a number of things that we need to realize. First of all, this is a very time-consuming process. It can be really slow. For authors, this can be very frustrating. Some of you may have that experience yourself. Also, the other way around, for the peer review process that journals run, this is creating a lot of pressure on these systems, because these articles need to be reviewed a number of times by all these different journals. And each time, experts need to be found that are willing to review these articles, that are willing to make time available to do that. So that is creating a lot of pressure on the system. The other thing is that journals increasingly, open access journals, they get paid for publishing articles. And that also creates incentives that are perverse. For journals, it might actually be attractive to publish articles that are of low quality, because the journals get paid for doing so. And more we see all these discussions about low quality research being published in journals. Research that perhaps actually shouldn't be published, because in terms of quality it is actually quite poor. So we see more and more of these challenges around research integrity. And partly that is a result of the way in which, on the one hand, the reward system in science is organized. So researchers are under pressure to publish a lot. But at the same time, it is also a consequence of the way in which we organize the publishing system, with journals being paid to publish articles. So this system, I would argue, is not really serving us well. It is a system that is increasingly kind of failing to deliver to the research community and to science at large what we actually need. More and more the system is moving towards more openness, not just open access publishing, but also other forms of openness. And this, I think, is enabling us to gradually move towards a better system. And I will tell you now what I think are the opportunities that we have. So first of all, what we see is that journals increasingly publish the reviews. So when journals publish an article, they publish not just the article, but they also publish the reviews of that article, based on which the journal decided to publish the article. I think this is important, because this makes visible the quality assurance process that the journal is organizing. It makes visible in a very transparent way, based on what kind of information a journal made a decision to publish an article. So journals that are problematic, sometimes they're called predatory, as you probably know, for them, this is very difficult. It's difficult for predatory journals to publish credible reviews that justify why certain articles get published. For journals that are doing rigorous peer review, rigorous quality assurance, publishing reviews is a way to show to the community, like, we put a lot of effort into doing proper quality control. You can really trust the research that is published in our articles. And for authors, of course, and for reviewers, this is also beneficial. Authors get additional credit. They do not only get the credit of publishing in a journal, but on top of that, they get the credit of review reports that are published alongside their article and that also confirm the quality of the work. And reviewers may also get credit, especially when they choose to sign the reviews. So they do not only review the article, but they also reveal their identity, sign the reviews, and they can get credit for doing all this work of reviewing the article. So I think this is a movement that is very interesting and that is actually making the whole system more transparent, which I would argue is beneficial. But there's more. What we also see, and it's in green here on this slide, we see that articles increasingly are published already prior to being submitted to a journal. So researchers increasingly publish their articles on a preprint server before they submit them to a journal. This is, for instance, something that I always do. I always publish all my articles on a preprint server before submitting them to a journal. So these articles on the preprint server, they have not been peer reviewed. So the quality is kind of unclear for readers. But the good thing is that they are made accessible openly, freely. So anyone can read them. There are no paywalls. There are also no charges for authors. So authors don't need to pay for this. And there are no delays. So the delays that we normally have in the journal publishing process, you don't have them for preprints. It takes just 1 day, typically. 1 day for a preprint to be published. Preprint servers, they typically do some screening to make sure that the research is legitimate, but they don't do in-depth peer review. And that's why the whole process takes only 1 day. So preprints have important benefits. They speed up the dissemination of scientific research. They make research more accessible for readers. And they don't charge authors, unlike many open access journals. And in that sense, they are also provide a more equitable way for research to be communicated and disseminated. So this, I think, is a very important and positive development. And I would say we should all do this. We should all publish all our articles on preprint servers before we submit them to a journal. But there's even more going on at the moment. What we also see is that new mechanisms for doing peer review are being developed. So more and more we see that peer review is organized outside the journal system. And we have peer review being organized directly around preprints. So there are services, online platforms that organize peer review for preprints. Completely new way of doing peer review. Fully open and transparent, so the reviews are always published. The reviews are published and linked to the preprint. And actually, the journals are not really necessary anymore to do peer review. Often what happens is that authors publish their work on a preprint server. They then also submit their work to a preprint peer review platform. This platform organizes transparent peer review. The reviews are published. And then typically authors still submit their work to a journal because they still want to publish in a journal. For instance, because often the way researchers are evaluated requires them to publish in journals for career purposes. But what we also see is that a next step is being taken, and this is really the most recent developments. These preprints are not only being peer reviewed, they are also then being assessed by editorial teams of experts that organize the peer review and that then provide an overall assessment of a particular piece of research, particular preprint, and they publish this assessment. And essentially now we have systems that are kind of replacing the entire journal-based system and offering an alternative for this system with public, open peer review around preprints and also editorial assessments of these preprints. And the interesting thing is that this means that also the way researchers get recognition, get rewarded for their work, can be organized without relying on journals. So instead of recognition for researchers being dependent on articles in journals, it can be made dependent on these new open, publicly available assessments that are provided online for preprints that researchers publish on preprint servers. So what we see here is a new system, a new way of communicating science that is more open. So the research can be read by everyone. There are no paywalls for readers, but there are also no paywalls for authors. So researchers don't need to pay APCs, article processing charges. At the same time, researchers can still get recognition in this new system, like they also got recognition in the old system from journals. And on top of this, the new system is faster. It's not as slow as many journals are in terms of the peer review system that is typically under a lot of pressure, and that is slowing down the dissemination of new research results. So the new system is faster, and I would argue it is more efficient, because with journals, as I mentioned, articles often get rejected multiple times and they need to be peer reviewed again, which is very time consuming. And in this new system, that is not necessary. So we see at the moment a development, and that is one of the key elements, I would say, of the open science movement, a development towards open scholarly publishing, completely new publishing practices. And perhaps the outcome of this will be that we don't need anymore this whole blue system, the journal system. Perhaps in the future, we can do without that whole system, and publishing can be organized entirely in the way we see here at the bottom of the slide in green. Okay. This whole idea is something that is going on at the moment. This is a culture change. This is a culture change that will take time, and in some disciplines and in some countries, more progress has already been made than in other disciplines and in other countries. For instance, in the life sciences, a lot is happening. I'm not a life scientist myself, but I'm studying what is happening in these fields. In life sciences, many of these new developments are being adopted at the moment by an increasingly large number of researchers. But we also see differences between countries. In Europe, for instance, there are countries where there's quite a lot of adoption of these new ways of working. Also in the US, we see this. In many other parts of the world, this is not yet happening, at least not to the same extent. So we are going through a culture change. This is a process that takes time, and also a process that is taking place at different speeds in different disciplines and in different parts of the world. But let me share with you my perspective on the process that is taking place. So what we see is, I would say, 5 steps of culture change. Culture change around preprinting, and ultimately culture change towards this new open way of doing scholarly publishing. And it all starts, I'm following here a model that was developed by Brian Nosek, one of the pioneers of open science. Culture change follows a number of steps, and it starts with making it possible. So making it possible is about creating the infrastructure that enables new ways of doing things. It enables more open ways of doing scholarly publishing, for instance. And preprint servers play an important role here. Preprint servers like Archive, bioRxiv, medRxiv, and a number of others, they play an important role in making possible new ways of doing publishing. This is typically not enough. When you make things possible, then some researchers will start to adopt these new ways of working, but most researchers will say, well, this is too complex for me. I don't really understand it. I'm just going to stick to my established way of working. What you also need, and that's step 2, you need to make it easy for researchers. And more we see all kinds of initiatives and organizations that are contributing to making it easy for researchers to adopt these new ways of working, to publish their work in different ways, to have their work peer reviewed in different ways. So you see all kinds of initiatives. I won't discuss them in detail, but these initiatives make it possible for researchers and make it easier for researchers to do to adopt these new practices. But even that is not always enough. When things are easy, then more and more researchers will adopt it, but still most researchers probably will kind of stick to their more traditional way of working. What we also need is to make it normative. At some point, the norms in how we do research, for instance, the norms in how we publish research, they start to shift. And we start to have conversations among each other that kind of lead to this shift in what is the norm, in the shift in what is normative. And this, I think, is happening at the moment. More and more, we are all kind of realizing that the new norm is to make your research openly accessible. Publishing research behind paywalls and having it completely inaccessible for basically anyone in the world is not acceptable anymore. That's more and more the consensus, so the norm has shifted. And I think we are now witnessing a new shift in the norms around publishing. Open access is still very important, but it's not enough. Expensive open access that needs to be paid by, for instance, article processing charges that are very high is also considered more and more problematic and is not really seen as something that is the right way of doing it. And new ways of doing it, like pre-printing, like these new forms of peer review, they are becoming more and more the new norm. But ultimately, of course, researchers will also say, I like all these new things, but this only works for me if I also get rewarded for doing for practicing these new ways of working. So the reward system also needs to be updated. So if I want to develop a career in science, then the way in which I'm being evaluated, being assessed, needs to be aligned with this new way of working. And that's also what we now see more and more. And I will say a bit more about that later in this talk. And finally, but that is really the ultimate stage, perhaps some of these new ways of working can even be made mandatory. So perhaps it can just be made required. We see that with open access. In more and more parts of the world, open access publishing is becoming kind of mandatory. Researchers must publish their work open access. And this is typically the final stage in the process of culture change. It's not the thing you should start with, but in a final stage, at some point when everyone basically agrees that a particular way of working is the right one, then you can even make it mandatory, make it required. And perhaps in the future, things like pre-printing and new ways of peer review that at the moment are still in a very early stage of development. Perhaps in the future, they will not only be the new norm, but they will also be rewarded everywhere in the world. And they may even become kind of mandated. They may become requirements for researchers. And this is the process that at the moment, I believe we are going through. For people like many of you that practice bibliometrics, this raises many questions because bibliometricians are studying the way in which scientific research is published. And we are also often creating all kinds of indicators or metrics that summarize what is happening in the publication system and that inform the evaluation system in science, that inform the way in which research are being evaluated, decisions about careers of research are being made. So we, as bibliometricians, have a very important responsibility to make sure that our bibliometric methods reflect the way research is being communicated, being published, and we need to update and adapt our methods when the way in which publishing is done is evolving. We need to make sure that our bibliometric methods co-evolve. Also, the way in which we inform research evaluators and the way in which we provide information to them needs to co-evolve with this changing publishing system. And I would even go one step further. I would even make the argument that it should not just only co-evolve with new ways of publishing, but I would even say that the way we do bibliometrics should actually set the stage for new, more open ways of doing scientific publishing. So just kind of following the trends and adapting to the new trends is not enough. We should do more, I believe. I think we have a responsibility to actually set the stage for these new, more open ways of working. Okay, I will now say a few more things about all these interesting developments in a bit more detail. First, I want to say that in preparation for this talk, I also looked at developments in your country, and I was pleased to see that you also have an Indonesian preprint server. So that's great. You see this more and more, that preprint servers are organized not only by discipline, which we see, for instance, with preprint servers like Archive for physics and bioarchive for life sciences and medRxiv for medical fields, But we also see preprint servers that are organized in such a way that they address particular countries or particular regions of the world, like this preprint server that you have for research from your country. That's great to see. It offers opportunities for researchers to make all kinds of choices in terms of how they would like their research to be disseminated through preprint servers. And using a country-specific preprint server is one particular option that researchers have. And I think here also on this preprint server, all the benefits of preprinting are explained in quite a nice way. So the benefit of making the research rapidly available, openly available, and doing so free of charge. So this is what I would recommend all of you to consider doing, to preprint your work and perhaps to do that indeed on a preprint server like this one for your own country. I'm based in Europe, and in Europe we have developments like this. We have research funders that are actually pushing quite strongly for a change in the way we do publishing. So we have Plan S. Plan S is an initiative by a number of funders, research funders. Most of them are based in Europe, not all of them. And they are pushing for open access publishing, but they are also, and that is really, really important, they are thinking more broadly about how scientific publishing can be done in more responsible and more open ways. Last year, they published this statement, and this statement is interesting because what it says, I won't go into the details, but what it says is that from the perspective of these these funders, there's no need for scientific articles to be published in journals. They say you don't need to publish your work in a scientific journal. Scientific journals organize peer reviews. Peer review is important. We want your work to be peer reviewed, but this does not need to be done necessarily by journals. It is also okay if your work is peer reviewed in different ways. If your work is, for instance, published on a preprint server and is then peer reviewed by preprint review services. And some of these services are mentioned here on this slide. For instance, Peer Community In is one of those. And that service was mentioned by Plan S as an example of a service that provides peer review outside the traditional context of journals. So what we see is that funders are endorsing these new ways of working. And that also means that funders are making a commitment that when funders evaluate researchers to make funding decisions, they say, we will not only look at the publications that you have in traditional journals. For us, publications that you have outside journals, publications that have been peer-reviewed in different ways, are equally important. And that's how we will evaluate you as a researcher. We will look at all your peer-reviewed works, regardless of where they got published, whether they got published in traditional journals or whether they got published in new ways. So this shows that the reward system is changing, and that's one important element in this culture change. What we also have is journals that are changing their way of working. So there is one journal in the life sciences that's called eLife, you may know it, and the eLife has decided to move to a completely different way of publishing. So they publish preprints, and they also publish peer review reports for these preprints, but they don't accept reject decisions anymore based on peer review outcomes. So traditionally journals do peer review and then they decide to accept or reject an article. eLife has now said, like, we simply publish all the articles that we send out for peer review. They're all published, also the ones that are of low quality. But what we do is we publish the articles together with the review reports. So it's the articles together with the reviews that we publish. And in that way, we inform readers about the quality of the articles. So readers can read the articles and they can read the review reports. And based on the articles and the reviews, and also an editorial summary of the outcome of the review process, readers can decide themselves whether they trust an article, whether they have confidence in the research or not. We just want to provide information that helps readers to develop their own perspective on the merits of a particular piece of research, the strengths, but also the weaknesses. This is a much more open, a much more transparent way of organizing scientific publishing and also organizing the evaluation of the quality of research. So this is, I believe, a really inspiring example of moving towards a new way of working. This is a recent article that was published by a large number of people. I'm one of them. And this is actually an article that makes the argument that this movement towards new preprinting and new ways of doing peer review around preprints, that this movement is a critical development taking place right now as part of the broader open science movement, and making our scholarly publishing practices more open. And it's a movement that we should all embrace and that we should all try to support. Okay, let me now move back to bibliometrics. In bibliometrics, as I already mentioned, we should adapt our methods to new ways in which scientific research is being published, being disseminated. And I recently published a blog post together with one of my colleagues in Leiden. I published a blog post in which I looked at well-known bibliographic databases to evaluate the extent to which they provide high-quality data on preprints. So preprints are, as I explained, are a really important development, and we studied the extent to which databases provide high-quality data on preprints. And this table summarizes our findings. So you see a number of bibliometric databases, Web of Science and Scopus, the well-known commercial databases, also Dimensions, which is another commercial database. And then you see two non-commercial open alternatives, namely Europe PMC and the Lens. And for these 5 databases, we show the extent to which they provide data, information about preprints. And we have distinguished 6 different types of information that they can provide. And the stars indicate how the different databases are performing. 2 stars means yes, there's a lot of information. We basically can find all the data that we need in these databases. 1 star means some information is there, but not enough. Not everything is there. There are gaps, information is missing, so the databases need to improve. And 0 stars means that there's almost nothing. And actually we have a big gap in our databases, a gap that urgently needs to be filled. So what we see is that fortunately, most of these databases have started to cover preprints. We see that in the top row of the matrix. Scopus and Web of Science, unfortunately, have only very limited coverage of preprints, so they do not yet properly cover preprints. They cover them only partly. The other databases do a better job. All databases, you see that in the second row of the table, all databases struggle to provide comprehensive metadata for preprints. So what you want to know, of course, for a preprint is you want to know the title, you want to know the names of the authors, but ideally there's more you want to know. You also want to have the abstract of the preprint, you want to know the affiliations of the authors, you want to know who funded the research, you want to know what's being cited by these preprints, the references in the preprints, and that information is only partly available in all the different databases. So what we see is that all these databases need to actually improve the way in which they provide data on preprints. Some need to improve more than others, but all these databases need to make further improvements. And that's quite a big challenge. And in this blog post, we discuss the gaps in all the data that is currently available, but we also make recommendations on how these gaps can be filled. And for people like many of you, people that practice bibliometrics, I think the important thing is, first of all, to be aware that some databases do a better job than others in terms of providing data on preprints. So when you make a choice on which database to use, that's something you should, I think, take into account. What you also see is that none of the databases gives you all the data that you need. So this is also something to address when, for instance, you are in a conversation with a particular database provider. You may ask them, like, could you please improve your data? I need more data from you on preprints. It's important. And ultimately, I would say that we as bibliometricians, we have a responsibility to also contribute to filling the gaps in this landscape. And making sure we have better data, and I will get back to that later on. But we also see, and I published another blog post on that, we see more and more peer review that is done openly. I already mentioned that, but we also see that data is becoming available on that. Databases gradually start to provide data on openly available peer review reports. So what you see here at the right is you see the number of peer review reports that are openly available and for which data can be found in an infrastructure that is called Crossref. Crossref is an important provider of open metadata on all kinds of research outputs, including peer review reports. And you see here that in the past few years, there has been a huge growth in the number of review reports that are openly available and that have open metadata in Crossref. So for all these review reports, and there are now tens of thousands of these reports, you can get the information from Crossref, and it's all openly and freely accessible. So this is again illustrating this development that we're going through at the moment. It's also showing how more and more data is being made available to bibliometricians, but it also shows at the same time that we still have challenges, because ultimately only a relatively small proportion of all the peer review is open, and only a small proportion of all that open peer review also has data available in databases like Crossref. So we also are facing major challenges. As bibliometricians, many of us are also publishing themselves. So many of us publish themselves their research articles. And this is also where I think we should take the lead in adopting new ways of working, trying to practice open science, put open science in practice in the way we publish ourselves. So at my center at Leiden University, we are organizing a conference. It will take place in September. In that conference, we are experimenting with open science practicing, including new ways of publishing. So researchers that want to present work at the conference, the STI conference, Science and Technology and Innovation Indicators conference, they are invited. Researchers are invited to submit a paper. All these papers get published on a preprint server, and they get peer-reviewed openly. And all the peer reviews are published on a particular platform where anyone can read them. What we're also doing is in my field, in the field of bibliometrics, in the field of research on research, we are at the moment working on setting up a new platform for the evaluation of research and the publication of research. It's called Meta Research Open Review, which is abbreviated as MetaROR. That's another development that's taking place right now, and that will enable all of us in this field to practice open science, to practice preprinting, to practice open peer review, to practice open access, and to do all of this in an easy way, a way that is easy to do, a way that will be free of charge. And I hope that many of us will kind of start to adopt these new ways of working. Okay, that that concludes my kind of the overview that I wanted to share with all of you on open scholarly publishing. I now would like to say a few things about open publication metadata. And this is going to show you a new way of doing bibliometrics that is much more open. So I have just shown you how the way in which researchers publish is becoming more and more open. I now would like to also share with you how we as bibliometricians can be more open in the way we do bibliometrics and the way in which we work with publication metadata. So in Europe, we have an initiative now that is called the Coalition for Advancing Research Assessment. It's a European initiative, at least initially. It was an initiative that was started in Europe. It is now a global initiative, although it is still largely supported by organizations that are based in Europe. And this Coalition for Advancing Research Assessment is trying to promote new ways of assessing and evaluating scientific research and researchers. And they have published an agreement on reforming research assessment. And there are more than 500 research organizations, mostly in Europe, but also partly outside Europe, that have signed this agreement. I think there are no organizations from your country, from Indonesia, but also Indonesian organizations like universities are invited to actually join this coalition and sign this agreement. One thing the agreement says is this. The agreement says that we need to make sure that the data that we use to evaluate scientific research, for instance, the data that we use to create bibliometric indicators and metrics, that data should be independent and transparent and open. So the research community should own the data. The research community should make sure that the data is openly available so that when we do research assessment, everyone has access to the same information, the same data, and we as researchers can decide ourselves how we want to evaluate research, how we want to evaluate researchers, and we are not dependent on commercial companies that own all kinds of data about what is happening in the research process and that decide for us how this data should be used to evaluate researchers. So the idea is, and it's an idea that I strongly support, that we as research community should own that data, and we should make sure that we are in control in making decisions about the way in which we use the data to create indicators, bibliometric indicators, metrics, and the way ultimately we use all of that information to do research evaluation. So a very important development, this Coalition for Advancing Research Assessment. Hopefully the coalition will also be joined by organizations from Indonesia. But it raises a question. It raises the question whether we still need databases like this. Web of Science, Scopus, Dimensions, these are databases that have been extremely useful for the bibliometric community, providing the data needed to do bibliometric analysis, to create indicators, metrics, to support research evaluation. But these databases, they all have the downside, the limitation of being proprietary databases. So they are closed databases owned by commercial companies. You need to pay to get access to the data, at least for Web of Science and for Scopus. Dimensions also has a freely accessible version. But also the way in which you can use the data is restricted in all kinds of ways. So when you have access to these databases, you can use the data, but only in restricted ways. You cannot, for instance, redistribute the data, at least not large amounts of data from these databases. And that often means in practice that when we use data from these databases to do research evaluation, we can only use the indicators or the metrics that are provided by these databases or by all kinds of tools that are built on top of these databases, like tools like Insights and Sciful. Some of you may know these tools. What we cannot do is use the data ourselves in the ways we would like it to be used. That is typically not possible. There are too many restrictions on how the data can be used. That applies in particular to Web of Science and Scopus. Bibliometrics is a database that offers more flexibility, but ultimately also that database still imposes all kinds of restrictions on how the data can be used. So the question is, do we still need this? Do we still need these types of databases when we do bibliometrics, or can we actually do this in a different way? Can we perhaps use databases like those? So these are all kinds of new databases, new infrastructures, open infrastructures that are freely accessible and that can be used to obtain basically the same data that we also obtain from the commercial databases. Sometimes you can get even more data that is not available in the commercial databases. Sometimes it's the other way around. Sometimes the commercial databases provide data that you cannot get from the open databases. But this is rapidly changing. More and more the open databases provide the same data that you can also get from the commercial databases. And I will tell you a bit more about these developments. So one database that I already briefly mentioned is Crossref. And Crossref is really a very important database. Crossref is a database through which publishers of journals or preprint servers can make data available about the articles that they publish. And we see, for instance, here at the left, we see Royal Society. Royal Society, a publisher in the UK, they make a lot of data available about all the articles that they publish. You can see that in all these graphs here in this chart. So they make references available, they make abstracts available. All that information about reference lists, about abstracts is made openly available in Crossref, and anyone in the world can obtain that data, can download that data free of charge. You don't need to pay for it. Some other publishers, unfortunately, don't do this yet. So there's also here at the right, there is the American Psychological Association, and they don't make references openly available. They don't make abstracts openly available. They could do it, but they have chosen not to do it, which is I would say, disappointing. It's actually in tension with the movement towards open science, but some publishers make that decision not to support these developments. We as researchers, but also as librarians and as bibliometricians, we of course have the option to not to work with publishers that don't support these developments. So we have the option when we choose, for instance, to publish in particular journals, or when we choose to make agreements with particular publishers, we have the option to do this only with publishers that support these developments towards openness of all this data. And then some publishers are doing much better than others. There have been particular initiatives that have promoted the openness of bibliographic metadata. One of those is the Initiative for Open Citations. So the Initiative for Open Citations over the past 5 or 6 years has pushed for citation data to be made openly available. So in the past, the only way in which you could get access to citation data is through closed databases like Web of Science, and you needed to pay a lot of money for that. Nowadays, citation data is almost completely openly available, in particular through this database that I mentioned, Crossref. Crossref is making a lot of citation data openly available, and that's thanks to this Initiative for Open Citations. There is a similar initiative for open abstracts. I'm actually the coordinator of that initiative. And the Initiative for Open Abstracts is trying to convince publishers to make the abstracts of articles openly available in this same database, in Crossref. And you see here at the right that more and more publishers are actually doing this. They are shown here in orange, and they make abstracts openly available for all or for almost all their articles. But there are also still publishers in blue that unfortunately don't do that. And in particular, big publishers like Elsevier and Springer Nature and Taylor and Francis and IEEE, unfortunately, they do not yet make abstracts openly available, which I believe is a problem. There's one big publisher that is Wiley, and Wiley has recently announced that they will start to make abstracts openly available. So they are going to join this movement, which is good news. And there's more that is happening. So this database Crossref is providing a lot of open metadata, data that in the past you could only obtain through databases like Web of Science and Scopus. You can now get it from Crossref, but there's more that is happening. There are new databases being built like OpenAlex, you see it here at the left, OpenAlex that are providing even more open data. So OpenAlex is making available all the data that can be obtained from Crossref, but on top of that, they obtain even more data from publishers, from publisher websites, and they make all the data openly available. And this data source, OpenAlex, is becoming almost as rich as traditional databases like Web of Science and Scopus. And in some sense, actually, this new database like OpenAlex, they provide more data. They provide, for instance, data on many journals, in particular also journals from countries outside the global north. They provide data on journals from these countries, and these journals are typically not indexed in traditional databases like Web of Science and Scopus. And at the right, you see an example of what can be done based on all this data. This is something that is done by the Curtin Open Knowledge Initiative, COKI, colleagues based in Australia. They provide an open access dashboard, and that open access dashboard, it shows for different countries the level of open access publishing, and this is all based on open data from sources like Crossref and like OpenAlex. So they don't use data sources like Web of Science or Scopus, but they use open databases. So this shows the new way of doing bibliometrics. You could perhaps call it Bibliometrics 2.0 or Open Bibliometrics. Bibliometrics that is fully based on open data. It's fully transparent, It's fully reproducible. The data is freely accessible. This is, I would say, a much better way of doing bibliometrics. So this is an editorial in the journal Nature, and also the journal Nature itself was giving, in this editorial that was published last year, that was giving very strong support to all these developments. So what you see in this editorial is that the journal Nature makes the argument that all publishers and all journals should support developments like Initiative for Open Citations, initiatives for open abstracts, and all publishers should make all the metadata of the articles they publish openly available. So this is quite interesting that the journal Nature is giving strong support to this. Actually, the journal Nature itself as a publisher that does not support these developments, but the editors of the journal were making the case, a very strong case, for openness of all metadata. At my center in Leiden, we create a ranking, a university ranking that is called the Leiden ranking. It's a ranking that is fully based on bibliometric statistics. This ranking is based on Web of Science data. So we started to produce this ranking in 2007. At that time, Web of Science was basically the only data source that was available. And that's why we are using that database. At the moment, we announced it just a few weeks ago. At the moment, we are in the process of trying to find out how we can move from the use of this closed Web of Science data to open alternatives. So we are exploring how we can produce an open edition of the Leiden ranking based on data from data sources like Crossref and OpenAlex. And we expect that later this year we will release this open edition of the Leiden ranking. And this is actually for my center, for CWTS, and for my center in Leiden, this is showing actually the strategic direction in which we are moving. So we have done, over the past 4 decades, we have done bibliometrics based on closed data from Web of Science, data from other closed databases. But in the next few years, we're going to fully move towards open data sources. And all the bibliometric analysis that we do will be based on these open data sources. And the shift that we're making for the Leiden ranking is just one illustration of this new strategy, this new way of working. And in Europe, there is a project that I'm involved in, and that is called the GRASP-OS project, funded by the European Commission. And this project is about making research assessment more responsible and more aligned with open science practices. And one thing that is done in this project is new open infrastructures are being created to support new ways of doing bibliometrics that are fully open and that enable transparent ways of using bibliometrics in research assessment. We are setting up at the moment a community of practice that anyone in the world who is interested in these developments can join. So at the moment, this community of practice is being created, being set up. We are also in the process of setting up a so-called working group in the Coalition on Advancing Research Assessment. And that working group will work on establishing open infrastructures for responsible research assessment. Also, this working group will be open to basically anyone in the world who is interested in being part of these developments. So this is also an invitation to all of you. If you are interested in this, you are very welcome to join these types of initiatives. The meetings will all be online, so it's easy to join also for individuals and organizations outside Europe. Okay, I will now conclude this presentation. I would like to conclude by sharing a few recommendations with all of you. So this presentation is about bibliometrics in the era of open science, and I would like to recommend a few things based on what I shared with you. I would like to first of all make the recommendation that we should stop restricting bibliometric analysis to only journal articles. This is increasingly problematic. Doing bibliometrics only based on journal articles is problematic because more and more research outputs are communicated and disseminated in different ways outside journals. And we discussed the preprints. There's actually much more going on. I didn't have time to discuss all of that, but preprints are one prominent example of this development, and it's crucial for bibliometrics to consider this. Second, we see also that peer review is changing. Peer review is increasingly becoming more open. We know that journals struggle to do high quality peer review. We have lots of discussion about predatory journals, journals that do questionable practices that perhaps don't really do proper peer review. At the same time, we see this movement towards open peer review, journals publishing peer review reports, but also open peer review being done outside the journal system around preprints. What does it mean for bibliometrics? It means that research outputs need to be valued bibliometrically, not only based on how many citations they have received, not only based on the journal in which they were published, but we actually have an important alternative way of valuing research outputs. We can use all that information that is available in open peer review reports. We can use all that information to value research outputs, to provide systematic information about the way in which the scientific community is valuing research outputs, like scientific articles. So this means we may need to think about new ways of developing bibliometric indicators not based on, for instance, citation counts, but based on information from open peer review reports. And finally, to enable responsible use of bibliometrics, we should make a transition towards data sources for bibliometric analysis that are fully open. So this was recommended. This is recommended by the Coalition for Advancing Research Assessment. This is recommended more and more by all kinds of stakeholders in the system. So doing bibliometrics in a closed way, based on closed data sources that provide non-transparent indicators is problematic, and we need to move away from that practice. It should all be done based on open data. So, what is the overall conclusion from all of this? Bibliometrics shapes the way in which scientific work is being published and evaluated. So what we do as bibliometricians is not just kind of observing the way researchers publish their work, but we are also shaping it by making the choice to include particular ways of publishing in our indicators and to exclude others. We influence and we shape the way in which researchers publish their work, disseminate their work, communicate their work, and ultimately the way in which scientific research is evaluated. And the fact that we shape the way all of this is done means that we have a special responsibility. First of all, as bibliometricians, we must adapt our bibliometric methods to changing publication and evaluation practices. But this is not the only thing that we should do. This is actually not enough. We also, I believe, have a professional responsibility to proactively set the stage for more open and transparent ways of publishing, more open and transparent ways of evaluating scientific work. And all the recommendations that are on this slide, that's the types of things that I believe we should all start to work on proactively in order to set the stage for more open ways of working in science, in the research system. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Prof. Ludo. Yeah, a very, very interesting topic and also interesting presentation. Yeah, very clear presentation. Yeah, that now in publishing of articles getting more difficult. Yeah, if all are just depended on the article journal that under Scopus or something like that, that needs longer time to publish, within maybe not only one in a day, on a month, even in a year. Yeah, and this the topic about e-print, about preprint will be interesting, yeah, because it can be faster and can be spread out in just a matter maybe a day or a week and read by a lot of users. But surely there must be some advantages and disadvantages, yeah. And then if all of the writer just depends on the publishing or publication in a journal or a reputed international journal, Scopus, Index, etc., it must be need longer time, yeah. But it's also still like in Indonesia, still in the policy, and the policy that some requirements for promotion need to be published under Scopus or something like that. But more and more writers, yeah, and then tends to use the preprints, yeah, in disseminating or in publishing, yeah, and it's surely, I'm not mistaken, open access. I think that already mentioned free of charge, free from the writer and also free from the users. Yeah, but surely there must be more interesting problem behind this that must be discussed. Yeah, especially dealing with also how to relate the preprints publishing with the bibliometrics, yeah, in order to anticipate for the future growth. Okay, now participants, time is yours to give comments or to ask questions dealing with the topic. Yeah, you may raise hand or you may write on the chat. Yeah. Yeah, while waiting for the participants to answer, yeah, let's. I also want to ask Prof. Ludo, yeah. Yeah, that's the intertwining, yeah, the pyramid hierarchy, number 1 up to number 5 on your presentation, and how to classify that this preprints belongs to number 1 to number 2 to number 3 and the last number 5. Thank you.
So,
klasifikasi koleksi yang ada, koleksi perpustakaan yang ada itu bisa seperti itu. Ya, jadi atau kalau misalnya yang promosi pernah membuat materi.
Sorry, the voice from Okay, maybe let's to initiate the question from the participants. Yeah, dealing with the pyramids hierarchy of pyramids number 1 up to number 5. Maybe you may explain more detail, probably.
yeah, perhaps I could say a bit more about indeed that pyramid model. But I think what we see is that when you discuss developments like this, like open science and open access publishing and preprinting and many of these things, then most researchers will typically say, like, in principle, I like these developments. In principle, I'm in support. But in practice, this is difficult for me because I don't understand it in enough detail. I don't really know how to do it, or it takes too much time. I'm too busy. I have too many other things that I need to do, or if I'm the only one who's going to do it, then there's no point in doing it. It only works if everyone is going to do this. Or people will say, like, well, I need to think about my career. If I want to develop a career, then actually this new way of working is not the right one. So while in theory, we often tend to support all kinds of new ways of working, in practice, it tends to be really difficult to move towards these new ways of working. And I think the pyramid model is interesting because it shows, it doesn't offer a magical solution to this problem. This culture change will always be a challenge, but at least it shows a systematic way in which we can think about what steps need to be taken in order to realize that culture change. And so these 5 steps are steps that always seem to be essential. So going from making it possible at the start, which typically means that some very basic infrastructure needs to be available, to then making it easy, because just having the infrastructure in place typically is not enough. Things should be relatively easy for people to really kind of adjust their behavior, making it normative. So people should feel like, oh, this is the right way of doing things. This is how I am supposed to do it. So that's the 3rd layer of the pyramid. The 4th layer, then people should really be rewarded for doing these new things. People should feel like this really is something which, when I do it, is also, for instance, in the research system, going to help me build a career in science. And then finally, as I mentioned, perhaps at some point it might be needed to make things mandatory. I could also imagine that in some cases that actually doesn't need to be done. It may not always be necessary. These 5 steps are crucial, I would say, in adopting open ways to scholarly publishing, but actually they are important in all kinds of culture changes that we need to go through in the research system.
Okay, then so it means that it seems on the importance of the information by the by the readers on the audience, and then you classify about this. Okay, there is a question in the chat. Yeah, so let me read. Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Ludo. My question may be simple. How the future of bibliometrics? How about the what's this up here? And can you gonna make it better for academic publishing culture or not? But dealing with the future of this bibliometric.
Oh, that's a nice question. Yeah, I didn't discuss that indeed. All the developments around artificial intelligence. I think we see an interesting thing happening at the moment. We see on the one hand, at least it's very important in Europe at the moment, and also in my country, in the Netherlands, we see a very strong feeling that people have that we are relying too strongly on metrics, on numbers, on quantitative indicators, and too many decisions in the research system are being made just based on a few numbers, and that is considered to be problematic and even dangerous. And we need to move towards doing more what is often called qualitative judgment. So experts developing an expert opinion on the quality of research, on the work of a particular scholar, and making decisions based on that expert opinion, which might be supported by data, by indicators, but the data, the indicators should not be in the lead. The interesting thing is that the AI movement can be seen as kind of a movement in the opposite direction, a movement where we have the idea that perhaps all kinds of decisions that are currently made by humans can be fully automated. And in that sense, we seem to be having two movements that go in opposite directions. So the movement that is often called responsible research assessment in Europe, and on the other hand, the AI movement, which kind of are moving in completely opposite directions, with one movement emphasizing the importance of human expert judgment, the other movement emphasizing the potential of algorithmic data-driven solutions. If we see it like this, like a tension between two different movements, then my personal feeling is that the movement towards more qualitative expert judgment is kind of the way to go. I'm a bit concerned about further kind of outsourcing all kinds of judgments, important judgments, value judgments that we make in science, outsourcing them to technology, to algorithms, to data. In particular, because many AI solutions lack transparency. They are even less transparent than traditional bibliometric indicators based on closed data. I think, however, there's also a way to see AI as a positive development. When you think about AI in a slightly different way, not so much as black boxes that are going to kind of automate all kinds of decision-making processes, but if you think about AI as a way to develop transparent, rule-based approaches to support human decision-making, then I think there is value in AI. But that's a bit different type of AI than the AI that is currently very popular, the deep learning type of AI. So it depends a bit on how we interpret the notion of AI and which particular flavor of AI we are focusing on. I hope that is a helpful response.
Yeah, okay, that's seems to be clear, and that the bibliometrics must be very, very important, in making decision in the future, because based on the track or based on the history and then the results of the analysis based on the statistic, can be the point for making decision better in the future as well. Okay, and Prof. Ludo already explained about the open access of, and there are also some server available providing access for preprint. Yeah, and one of the participant asked about how does the preprint server get benefit in giving service, because as already mentioned, that is free or open access.
Yeah, that's another really good question. I don't think if you want to get rich, you probably shouldn't run a preprint server. That's not the best way to get rich. So running a preprint server is a relatively inexpensive thing to do compared to, for instance, running traditional journals with extensive peer review processes. So it is relatively inexpensive because journals bring all the additional work of organizing peer review. And of course, commercial journals owned by commercial publishers also are supposed to make profits, and they invest a lot in advertising and all of these things. So running a preprint server is relatively cheap, but it's not, of course, free of charge. It does take effort. It does take money to run a preprint server. So the question that is asked here is a very legitimate one. So I was very kind of positive about the whole preprint movement, and I told you, like, we should all embrace this. But indeed, ultimately, there's going to be a question, like, who then is going to run these preprint servers, going to make sure that all these articles are being screened, end up on the servers. That involves a cost. That cost needs to be covered by someone. What we see at the moment is that we have charities often covering this cost. Like, for instance, bioarchive is funded by a charity, that is one way in which this can be done, but it's not really clear whether that is sustainable in the longer term and whether that is scalable. So I must indeed admit that we are still facing some challenges around preprint servers and their sustainability. My expectation is, looking at the landscape, at least here in Europe, that I think there is quite some support in Europe for recognizing that this is something that's very important, and that there's a kind of a necessity here for public funding, basically governments stepping in and providing the funding to keep these platforms running. It's about relatively limited amounts of money that are needed for this compared to what is currently being spent in terms of journal subscriptions. So that is a bit what I think is the longer term solution.
Okay, yeah. So you also mentioned that the funding may comes from a charity, or if possible from government, or maybe also from advertisement, advertising available. Yeah. And that's the next question, Prof. Ludo. So many questions here. Next question is, what's the correlation between bibliometric and preprinting? That's a simple question, and maybe some already discussed, but we need more explanation about this.
Yes. So I think correlation in the sense of a relationship between bibliometrics and preprinting. For me, the relationship is that bibliometrics is about studying what researchers publish. But we should all realize that publishing can no longer be interpreted as just publishing in journals. That's an old-fashioned way of thinking about publishing. So publishing should mean all forms of publishing, and preprints then are a very important part of that. And actually, we should perhaps think even more broadly about this. We also see that many researchers, for instance, write lots of blog posts. So perhaps these blog posts should also be considered part of publishing. That's, I think, open for discussion. But at least preprints should be part of the way we do bibliometrics, and excluding them is increasingly problematic.
Okay, this must be a relationship, between the two parts. And then the next question is, Open Science emphasizes the importance of sharing data and prompting the reuse of scientific resources. How can bibliometrics be used to assess and measure the impact of sharing scientific data? this example on how openly shared data has impacted the research?
Yeah, I didn't discuss all of these questions, all of these developments, but they are a very relevant element of the broader discussion about open science, and also of kind of what bibliometrics, how bibliometrics should kind of respond to all this open science development. So what you see is, first of all, questions about data citations. So there's kind of a recognition more and more that researchers that use or reuse a particular data set have an obligation to cite the data set, just like we cite the articles that we rely on. It's still, again, it's also a culture change. So we still see that many researchers don't really do this, even though perhaps theoretically speaking, we all understand we should do that. But in practice, it is happening only at a relatively small scale, unfortunately. But we should cite our data sources. And then we need to have databases that keep track of all these citations. As some of you know, there are interesting initiatives like there's DataCite, there is initiatives like Make Data Count, there is work on a global data citation corpus. So there's lots of things going on in that space, but it's a bit like the preprints. It's in a relatively early stage of development. So I would say we should all support these things. We should support this. And hopefully in the next few years, this will all become more mature. Examples of how openly shared data has impacted other research. I think we have seen that during the COVID pandemic. In the COVID pandemic, we have seen in the life sciences that data was being shared in an early stage, and that was really important in the development of vaccines. So we have some of these high-profile cases that show the benefits of data sharing. But at the same time, it needs to be recognized that often researchers make all the efforts to share data, and in the end, reuse is not really happening. So there's also a question like, is it always really kind of necessary to put so much effort into data sharing if in the end reuse will be limited?
Okay, thanks. Okay, participants, while before I continue reading the question, maybe if you directly raise your hand and ask directly, will be clearly, yeah, because will be more interactive to Prof. Ludo. Okay, while waiting for this, so I'll read on the next question, Prof. Ludo. Why should we use data source for bibliometric analysis be fully open to follow the responsible use of bibliometric? Does it have something to do with quality, just accessibility? Is it not possible for closed access article to be analyzed bibliometrically if we have access? Is it permissible if we combine sources from both? That's the question.
Yeah. I think there are two types of answers. There's a pragmatic answer and there is a more idealistic type of answer. So the idealistic answer is the answer that I was trying to give in my lecture, and I showed that slide where I showed a statement from the Coalition on Advancing Research Assessment. And I think that's the idealistic perspective. Like, ultimately, we researchers, the research community, we need to be in control of all the data about what is happening in our own system, in the research system. If we are not in control of that data, if it is kind of outsourced to companies that own our data, then ultimately we lose control about the way in which that data is used to make decisions. Because these companies are the only ones that kind of have the full access to the data and are capable, therefore, of using the data to create indicators, metrics, perhaps even AI solutions. And these indicators, metrics will then ultimately dictate how decision-making is done. So at that idealistic level, I think the answer is no, this is a problem, all that closed data that is used to make decisions in science, to evaluate research, data needs to be open. In practice, we are at the moment, we are in a kind of a transition, I think, a transition where for a long time we have been working with closed data. We now have more and more opportunities to work with open data. the same time, we also see that there's an increasing reliance in many parts of the world on bibliometric indicators. And bringing these two things together, I feel that we, at a pragmatic level, we need to recognize that whenever possible, we need to start making a shift from the closed to the open data. But this isn't something that cannot be done overnight. This is also a culture change, also something that takes some time. At my center, we have agreed in our strategic plan that we will, for instance, in the next 4 or 5 years, we will make this transition. And in this transition period, we will be pragmatic. We will partly be relying on closed data, partly on open data. So that's the way I see this.
Okay, thanks. Then next question, would you like to share what kinds of feedbacks did you receive from VOS viewer users? What is the direction in the development of iOS viewer for the next decades? How do you imagine the future body of knowledge and its sorry, long enough. And how is the direction of the development of iOS viewer for the next decades? How do you imagine the future body of knowledge and its consequences after the era of mass usage bibliometric analysis? Thank you.
Oh, yeah. So for those of you who don't know, I'm one of the developers of the Phosphor software for visualizing bibliometric networks. My colleague, Nejan van Eck, is the main developer. I'm a co-developer. I appreciate the question in particular because it refers to the next decades. I've never really thought about the future of the software at that time scale, I must admit. I think the most important thing we are doing at the moment is also for the Phosphor software to make the transition to an open science way of working. So the software used to be software that was supporting the closed data sources, not so much the open data sources. At the moment, we are more and more shifting towards offering support for the open data sources. We still also support the closed data sources, but the open ones like Crossref and OpenAlex are becoming increasingly important. In addition, also the software itself, we are making it open source. It was not open source in the past, but we are moving in that direction of the software being fully open source. And also, and that's the final thing, the software is moving from a model where it's a standalone piece of software that you run on your computer to software that can be integrated in web tools. So software that runs in your web browser and that can be integrated in dashboards. So we think that is the future. The future is that you don't work with tools like Phosphor as separate standalone tools, but you see them, you integrate them in dashboards and you link them directly to underlying open data sources. So that's basically the vision that we have.
Okay, yeah. Still questions again. Yeah. In the chat up room with the last, if not other Sangin. Could you please tell us what is the roles of bibliometrics regarding the preprint publication model? Order to explain that this preprints model is a good quality as the traditional journal model.
Let me try to give an example. I have articles myself that I wrote and that I'm proud of because I think they are useful scholarly contributions, but I did not publish them in a journal. I published them only on a preprint server. Because I thought that's actually enough. Why should I publish them in a journal? Just publishing them on a preprint server is enough to share them with everyone in the world. And traditionally, of course, we see publishing an article in a journal. We see that as a marker of quality. And I think that we are increasingly now moving to a situation where researchers will, like I'm doing myself, will only publish their work on preprint servers. and perhaps will then kind of have their work, their preprints peer-reviewed, but without submitting them to a journal. What might happen is that actually these preprints might start to attract, some of them, not all of them, of course, but some of them might attract a lot of attention, have a lot of impact, and get a lot of citations. And actually, we will more and more see examples of preprints that are extremely highly cited, but that never appeared in a journal. And we will see examples of preprints that have many, many more citations, even more than articles in prominent, reputable journals. So I think it will become more and more difficult to justify that the way we assess the quality or the impact of a particular scientific contribution is based just on where it appeared, the journal in which it appeared. That's more and more difficult to justify. And also as bibliometricians, we need to kind of think about better ways of doing that. And for instance, looking at citations given to preprints could be one such way of doing this.
Okay, with the same question and the same person who asked, well, question still one, and also still some more, but the committee already reminded me that time is very limited, so only just one reads, and the other, yeah, will be if Prof. Ludo does not mind, will be sent by email or WhatsApp to answer later on. Yeah, and this very last question to answer. Scopus recently updated its CSV-based metadata export facility, where the header and outer separator have changed so that VOS viewer cannot read it. Is there any update from VOS viewer to solve this?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I know that this is a problem, and I apologize to anyone who is kind of suffering from this, who is experiencing these problems. So VOS provides support for data export from Scopus in so-called CSV files, but often this doesn't work in the way it is supposed to work. So often users get error messages. VOS is unable to process the data. What is happening is that indeed Scopus is regularly updating its export format. And they don't tell us, so we don't know when an update has taken place. So we kind of, the only way we learn about it is by users complaining to us about the software not being able to process the files. That's one challenge we have. The other challenge is that the people at Scopus, and we know them and we are in contact with them, and we talk to them, but the problem is that they often make bugs in their software. So the software for exporting data from Scopus, there are bugs in that software. We discuss this with them. They try to fix them, but then usually new bugs are created. So often the data is not really in the right format. There are problems with the data. It's very difficult for us to keep supporting that CSV format. We invest a lot of time in it, and it's still, there are always problems. I'm unhappy about this. I don't really see a solution. We discussed it a number of times with the Scopus people, and we haven't together managed to find a solution. So we are trying to address these types of problems, but I think it will always remain a bit of a difficult problem. So I think this probably only confirms the bigger point that I was trying to make today, that perhaps we need to move away from relying too much on these established but closed and expensive databases, and we should consider moving to open alternatives. I think this is just another kind of reason for considering that movement.
Okay, then, so the rest of the question will be conducted later on because the limited times already finished. And before closing this, I mean this seminar, not the whole seminar, but the presentation of Prof. Ludo. So please give applause to him. Yeah, well, thank you very much, Prof. Ludo. Yeah, and times I'll give the time to the committee. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be at your conference.
Okay, you're welcome.
Yeah, I think that's all for this session. Thank you so much for our great speaker, Prof. Ludo. I believe me and our participant here actually got a very useful lesson with this session. Also, thank you for our moderator to lead the session as smooth as possible. But before we are closing the session, maybe it would be perfect if we are doing some documentation session. I think for the participant, please open your camera, and for operator, could you please help me to lead the documentation session, please? And for Prof. Ludo, could you please open up your camera so we could do some documentation? Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, for operator, are you ready? Yeah, I think I could lead this documentation. Yeah, 1, 2, 3. Yeah, for the next slide. Yeah, for the next slide. 1, 2, 3. Okay, I think for the next slide, because there are some slides here, I think we would pause sometimes. Once again, I think 1, 2, 3. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you so much for Prof. Ludo and also Mr. Jumino. And I think we proceed to the ISOMA session. And for Prof. Ludo, if you have some activities, you may leave this Zoom meeting. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. It was really a pleasure to be at your conference.
Thank you so much, Prof. Ludo.
We are so glad to have you here, Prof. Ludo. Thank you.
Izin kami tutup Zoom-nya, Bapak Ibu. Terima kasih Nabila, Pak Jum,
Ya,
terima
kasih
sudah
terima kasih peserta
memoderatori
semua.
kegiatan hari ini. Bapak Ibu, kami persilakan untuk sholat Jumat dan juga isomah ini. Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum.
Mungkin sebelum ditutup Pak Heri, mungkin ditandaskan lagi kalau ada pertanyaan-pertanyaan yang muncul bisa nanti dijabrikan langsung ke panitia, bisa disampaikan ke Prof. Ludo. Mungkin yang bersangkutan masih berkenan untuk menjawabnya.
Oke, siap Pak Jum. Dari panitia apa ada yang ingin disampaikan ke peserta? Tidak ada ya?
Ya, baik. Terima kasih Mas Heri. Tadi sebagaimana yang sudah disampaikan oleh Mas Heri, untuk peserta dapat langsung kegiatan sholat Jumat bagi yang menjalankan kegiatan sholat Jumat. Untuk sholat fardunya bisa di lantai dasar ya Mas Heri ya?
Di GSG juga ternyata aja lebih proper. Ya, lebih proper.
Oh, baik. Ya. Monggo, ya. Monggo untuk para peserta mengikuti arahan dari panitia, nggih. Mungkin kalau untuk yang berkenan makan siang terlebih dahulu juga insya Allah sudah siap. Betul?
Ya. Siap.
Baik, iya. Matur nuwun Pak Jumino dan seluruh rekan-rekan dari Prodi maupun dari Sivitas Universitas Diponegoro. Dengan ini kami berterima kasih untuk kesempatannya dan sampai jumpa di kesempatan-kesempatan berkolaborasi berikutnya. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Terima kasih semuanya.
Mas Bisi.